to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I would like to share with you ideas how to use your queen to optimally attack your opponent's king. Of course, it's rarely enough to have a queen to attack, but generally you would need the help of at least one other piece. It may be your bishop, your knight, your rook, sometimes even a pawn, or very rarely even a king. Well, let's get started with our first example. Here we go. In this position, both sides have castled to the queen side, as we can see, and black has an extra pawn, which typically would give a solid advantage. But black's problem is right now that the c pawn is no longer in its initial square back on c7. And that means that the diagonal h2 b8, especially of course the squares around the black king, are weak. That combined with the d file also being open and white having a rook there results in an opportunity for white to simply threaten to checkmate on the b8 square. With the natural developing move bishop to f4, white immediately threatens to checkmate on b8, and black does not have any real good ways to deal with that. Black would even be better off if they would not have the pawn on c6, because then their knight could go there, protect the b8 square. The best alternative here for black is to move the knight to d5, so at least the black king can run away when the check arrives on b8. While this delays the end, it certainly does not change the outcome of the game. White now captured the pawn, and sadly, blocking the check with the bishop wouldn't work at all because the knight is pinned on the d file, and therefore, among other winning moves, white could capture the bishop, or white could give a fork with knight e5 using the fact that the bishop is also pinned on c7. And if black moves the king to e8, white keeps grabbing all the pawns, and then white has a choice between immediately capturing the knight takes d5, or even better, play knight e5, attacking the black queen and bishop on g6 a second time. And now black cannot avoid lose a lot of material. So going back to our starting position here, it's very important that white acts quickly. There is no time for a slow motion move such as rook e1, because now black would have the time to move the knight away, and then the bishop would be able to come back to c7. Let's move on to our next example, where black has an extra bishop and couple of pawns. So again, if it was black's turn, for example, black would get the chance to move the bishop to g7, black would have an easily winning position. However, it is white's turn, and the g file has already opened up. That means that black certainly has danger along the g file. And therefore, the very logical attacking move is to bring our strongest, most powerful piece there, namely the queen to g4. This move immediately threatens to checkmate on g8. And the black pieces are positioned so unfortunately that the black bishop has nowhere to go other than to g7, of course, where it would be captured immediately, and the e7 square is occupied by the queen, therefore the black knight cannot arrive there, so black is just completely helpless against the upcoming checkmate. Again, it's very important that you remember these patterns, how the queen can collaborate with the different pieces. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. This is a tricky one. It's white to move in this position, and black has an extra exchange. So typically, being an exchange down is not a good thing. However, here, black has already weakened himself at an earlier stage of the game by moving the pawn up from g7 to g6. That has weakened the dark squares around the black king, and in fact, the white queen on h6 took advantage of that weakening. However, as I mentioned in the introduction, a queen in itself is rarely sufficient to result a winning attack. In this position, white has a knight to aid the queen. So white, pretty much good or bad, should try to play knight g5. This creates an immediate checkmate threat by queen captures pawn. If now the rook tries to run away to give an escape square for the king on f8, white would still capture the pawn and checkmate right away on the following move. So what can black do? After knight g5, obviously, black can give a check. This is a critical moment of this game. Right now, the white king has two options, either to go down to the first rank or move up to h3. Typically, h3 doesn't look very good. However, if the king moves down to the first rank to either g1 or h1, black will have no problem giving constant checks on the first and second ranks on d1 and d2. So what to do? Can white do better by moving king h3? Before you make that move, you should definitely look out, see if black has a defense here against the checkmate threat. Because if they don't, even though it looks weird and unusual to move a king out to h3, it's the right thing to do. I suggest you look around and try to figure out, see if black can defend here. And indeed, black now has a defense, and that means that if black can successfully defend against the checkmate threat, black will maintain his material advantage, having an extra exchange, and eventually win the game. In this position, black would play queen d7, and now after king h4, black could simply play f6 because all of a sudden the queen found itself in an ideal location guarding the h7 square. So what happened here is white went for the win but over-pushed. So therefore, in the situation when white got the check, the first check on d2, white had to recognize that it's better to have a draw than a loss, and move the king back to g1 when black would be forced to give constant checks until they reach 3 times the same position, and then the game can be claimed as a draw with threefold repetition. So what's the moral of the story? Always look out for your opponent's best replies, because only so you can make the objectively correct decision for your own moves. So in this case, king h3 would have been over-pushing, losing the game, while keep going down to the first and second rank would still save the game. Sometimes an attack, if achieving a draw, is also a success, especially when you're behind material like we saw in this situation. Let's move on to our next example, where it is black who has the attack, although white has significant material advantage. And again, this is a very typical attacking idea with the queen, and in this case, The aid of the queen is, the main aid is the pawn on g3. Typically, when the opponent castles to the king's side, having a pawn that far ahead, if you have an opportunity to then get a queen to the h-file, can be deadly, as this example demonstrates. Now the black queen is ready to go to h8 to immediately threaten with checkmate on h2. There's nothing white really can do about it. If white would clear some space for the king to escape, that's only a temporary solution, as after the queen check, queen h2 checkmates. Of course, the story would have been different if in this position the white rook would have been somewhere else, like on e3 even, for example, because then the king may have had an escape square on e2. But since it wasn't, it was on e2, black is winning. Let's move on and see an example when the hero is the king. As you can see, the white king is already in an unusually active position on g5. Of course, when the king is active, that's not always a plus. In fact, very often that's a big problem because it can get into trouble. And even in this case, if it would be black's turn, black would be doing fine, also having an extra bishop. Black would be winning pretty easily. However, it is white's turn. In this case, the white king could go to either h6 or f6 to try to support a checkmate idea with the queen on g7. However, accuracy is the key, and of course it's not the same in which direction the white king goes. If indeed the king goes to h6, it's true, black cannot give any immediate checks, but can run with the king to f8 and be okay. The difference is after the king moves to f6 compared to h6, that now after king f8, could white have also played queen c7 first, attacking the bishop, and then when that bishop moves out, then play king f6? Well, they certainly could if the bishop would move. However, in that case, after queen c7, black would get his queen to the defense, give up on the bishop, while white may have still a better position, but certainly not a winning one. Because even after queen takes bishop, white only balances the material and is not ahead. So queen c7 would be a mistake, missing the opportunity to win right away with king f6. Let's go on to our next example. And here, white is a rook down. That's a serious trouble. However, we can see the black king kind of being a little naked, no pieces to defend it. No pawns, no rook, no knight. It's kind of all by itself. Moreover, it has no place to go, so if the white knight could attack the king would be checkmated. And that, of course, gives it away. The white knight is ready to get into the action and move to h4, threatening with an immediate checkmate with knight g6. Black can give a check to delay the end, but it does not change really the substance. The checkmate threat is still there. While black can avoid the immediate checkmate by pushing the pawn up, it will cost him the queen. After knight check, queen needs to take, and of course white's advantage is quite significant. Let's move on. Here we go. Again in this position, black's king's position is a bit opened up, the g-pawn already being on h5, obviously recapturing something there. And it's also quite visible that white has two beautiful bishops pasting towards the black king. However, the question is, how can white take advantage of all of this? Black, in the meantime, has an extra pawn, so if black would succeed to trade bishops and then get the queen to f6 and defend, it would be black who is better. However, in this position, white can use the momentum, namely that there is a pin over the bishop on g7, and that allows the white queen to move to h6, threatening to checkmate immediately. And the problem is that if the black knight would move back to f8 or would move to g5, in either of those cases, all of a sudden white could capture the bishop with the queen and checkmate. And what happens if the black king runs? Well, obviously we take the pawn with a check, and then white can actually checkmate in 2 more moves by exchanging bishops on g7 and then checkmate in the corner. So here we saw how the queen collaborated with the 2 bishops in order to create checkmate. Let's see another example, which is a bit similar to another one we already saw. Here we go. In this case, it is black's turn. Just like in the last example, black here has 2 beautiful bishops facing towards the king's side. And just like in one of our first example that we've seen, white's problem is that the pawn is no longer on f2, but it is on f3. And that allows the black queen to cooperate with the dark squared bishop along the a7 g1 diagonal, and in fact create an immediate checkmate threat that white cannot defend against successfully only by giving up either a knight or a bishop, because white has too many minor pieces on the first rank. Let's see the next example. In this position, it is white's turn. Again, we see the 2 beautiful bishops looking at the black king. What black is suffering for is that he already at the earlier point moved up the pawn from g7 to g6. That usually is a sign of trouble if black had to do that when the king has castled to that part of the board and they no longer have a dark squared bishop sitting on g7 guarding the king. So therefore, the weak squares right now in black's position are g7 and h8. And again, this is a very typical idea pattern that I suggest you remember, that when a bishop and the queen in front of it can occupy that diagonal, can indeed create some very serious threats. And in this case, because the f-pawn is pinned, black is unable to push up the pawn to f6. If white would not have the bishop on c4, black could defend with f7, f6, and it wouldn't be anything really special. But since that pawn is pinned, now white is winning. Let's move on. Here we go. In this position, white again has similar problems. The g2 pawn is gone. It has recaptured at an earlier point on f3. Black already has the queen around there. But how can black make progress and win the game? Well, we need to bring another piece to the aid, and that piece should be the bishop. The white pieces are quite unfortunately positioned, not being able to protect the pawn on f3. And also, if that pawn advances, black just wins right away by playing bishop to f3, checkmate. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this position, black has a clear material advantage. The knight is hanging. What to do? How can white make progress here? Also, the bishop is hanging. Well, try to take your time and figure out the solution. And here is the solution. Amazingly, the solution is a quiet move. simply moving the bishop to f7. This creates a threat that you will see, for example, if black plays queen a6, then white checks and pretty much traps the black king, forcing the queen to capture the bishop, which of course leaves white with an extra knight and an unstoppable a-pawn. So let's go back. After bishop f7, which is a quiet move, sadly for black, black has no reasonable check, that is a check at a place where it wouldn't be captured. But black can capture the white knight. What happens now? Well, now the point is that the black king will be forced onto the same diagonal where the black queen is at. With two well-placed checks, finally the king ends up on g4, and then comes the fork. Queen takes, king takes, and white's a-pawn will arrive first, which is very, very important. After a5, h4, a6, h3, a7, h2, and a8, just on time, stopping the key promotion square on h1, and white is winning. Well, thank you for listening, and hopefully this will give you some ideas on how to use your queen ideally for attacks. And of course, I hope you had fun with the Jewel of the Week. Thank you for listening. So long until next week.